Business Profession Economic Development Committee joint oversight hearing on the Corinthian College's closures and what's next for California students. So thank you for attending this joint oversight hearing. The purpose of today's hearing is to understand the state and institutional efforts to assist students that have been displaced by the abrupt closures. In the last weeks, we have heard from students that are facing serious educational and financial repercussions, some of whom were merely units from completing their program and are now left with significant debt. Today, it is my hope that we not only find out what relief state agencies and institutions are offering the students, but also how we as a body can facilitate the realization of their educational goals. Lastly, it's important to note that the U.S. Department of Education was invited to participate in the hearing, but unfortunately they did not respond to our request. And also note that the agenda does not include any private for-profit institution. I'd like to acknowledge Senator Jerry Hill, the chair of the Senate Business Profession and Economic Development Committee, as a joining convener of today's hearing and invite him to participate in opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lewis. I appreciate your leadership on this issue and your committee consultants and staff for the great work that they've done in organizing this. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I know there's been a whole host of reaction to the closure of Corinthian colleges and to the needs of California students who attended Heald, Everest, and Wyotech schools here in California. I look forward to our conversation today, and I'm hopeful that learning more about the efforts that all of our panelists and their organizations are taking to assist students will ultimately bring us to a place of thoughtful action as we move forward. Most significantly is the fact that people up and down this state are working to better their lives through education and training, working to increase their employment viability, working to put food on the table for their families. These people rely on us. They rely on the decision makers in our position to ensure some baseline measures of quality in the programs that they attend to meet their goals of improving their day-to-day lives. We have a responsibility to do what we can to ensure that there is meaningful recourse for the thousands of students impacted by the abrupt closure of these schools, but also to the tens of thousands of students who will continue to seek opportunities at educational institutions. These are people's lives who are talking about, and often some of our most vulnerable population who we need to assist. I appreciate this important opportunity for this dialogue today and grateful that we are taking these steps to evaluate significant options for students in California. So thank you for that and for allowing me that opportunity. And we'll move to the first part of the program, which is item number 2 on our agenda, California Context for Corinthian Colleges and Closures. Ms. Hyman, good morning. And appreciate your coming today from the Principal Fiscal and Policy Analyst for the Legislative Analyst's Office. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for your participation. I'd like to welcome Senator Block, who sits on both committees, and Senator Bates.
Good morning. I am Judy Hyman from the Legislative Analyst's Office, and I'll provide you some context for today's discussion, including background on how private colleges are regulated in California, private college participation in the state's financial aid programs, a quick review of the events leading up to the Corinthian closures, and some of the implications these events have for the state and its students. Starting with the broadest context, private colleges enroll 1 out of 5 students in California. Nearly 60% of our students go to community colleges, about 20% go to UC and CSU, and about 10% go each to nonprofit private colleges and for-profit private colleges. 3 independent entities oversee these institutions: the U.S. Department of Education, accrediting agencies, and states. And you have that on page 1 of the handout that the sergeant just distributed. Starting with the federal role on page 2, the Department of Education sets standards for institutions participating in federal student aid programs, including Pell Grants and federal student loans. To participate in these programs, schools must be accredited by a federally recognized accreditor. In addition, starting July 1st of this year, all schools participating in federal student aid programs must be formally approved by the states in which they operate and must be subject to a state-run complaint process. These two requirements are called the new state authorization rules. A couple of other requirements I'll highlight. No more than 90% of a for-profit school's total revenue may come from the core federal student aid programs. That's called the 90-10 rule. Currently, veterans' benefits don't count towards the 90%. That's called the GI Bill loophole in the 90-10 rule. The Department of Education also sets limits on the share of an institution's students that can default on their federal loans within certain time periods, and is also implementing new rules called gainful employment rules for all vocational programs. And under these rules, schools whose graduates have unsustainable debt as measured by debt to earnings ratios will lose eligibility for federal student aid. Those go into place July 1st also. In addition to setting standards for institutions participating in federal student aid programs, the Department of Education provides some relief for students of closed schools. These students may be eligible for forgiveness or discharge of their federal student loans if they're unable to complete their educational programs because of a school closure. This comes with a big caveat. Students who transfer credit to another institution or participate in a teach-out agreement whereby they can finish their programs at another institution forfeit their eligibility for the student loan discharge. In addition to the closed school discharge, there's another provision of federal law that allows the department to discharge loans of students who were defrauded by their schools, students whose schools violated state laws. This is called the Defense Against Repayment provision, and it has been used only rarely. This type of relief may be available to students who don't qualify under the closed school discharge, for example, students who did finish their programs. The department is accepting individual applications for discharge under this provision and is currently facing political pressure to consider more of a blanket discharge under this provision of federal law, specifically for the Corinthian College students. Moving on to page 4, the second entity in the triad of agencies that oversees post-secondary education is accreditors. And there are two types of institutional accreditation, regional and national. Most degree-granting institutions, including all public institutions, most nonprofits, and some for-profit schools are regionally accredited by one of 6 regional accrediting agencies. Ours in this area is the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, or WASC. Most career-related schools, including most for-profit schools, are nationally accredited by accreditors such as the Accrediting Commission for Career Schools and Colleges and the Accrediting Council for Independent Colleges and Schools. Accreditation is a form of self-policing. Groups of colleges get together and hold each other to certain minimum standards and use peer review to help each other continuously improve. Notably, accreditors work with schools, not with students, so they don't help individual students resolve complaints. Accreditors require member schools to have policies in place regarding school closure, which include provisions for students to complete their educational programs, to make transcripts available to students, and to ensure that student records are maintained in perpetuity. The third part of the triad is the state regulatory agency. And on page 5, you can see that here in California, that's the Bureau for Private Post-Secondary Education, which was reestablished under the Private Post-Secondary Education Act of 2009. The goals of the act are to ensure minimum quality standards at private post-secondary schools, provide meaningful student protections and recourse for students, and provide an appropriate level of oversight for these schools, and to prevent harm to students and deception of the public resulting from fraudulent or substandard educational programs and degrees. Accordingly, the Bureau was established to license schools, monitor them, and provide recourse for students. The Bureau also maintains the Student Tuition Recovery Fund, or STRIF, which is supported by student fees from all institutions that are overseen by the Bureau. The fund is capped at $25 million and is currently over that cap by about $3 million. So the STRIF fee that students pay was reduced from 50 cents per $1,000 of institutional charges to 0 in January of this year. State law also establishes rules for school closure, very similar to those required by accreditors, whereby schools must have plans for an orderly teach-out, transfer of student records, and arrangements for refunds to students who could not complete their programs or receive a teach-out. And that brings us to page 6, and relief for students. The Student Tuition Recovery Fund reimburses students for economic loss, and more specifically monetary losses, such as tuition and required fees that they pay to a school that closes before they can finish their program, students' costs of required books and supplies for the program, and interest on student loans used to pay for those costs. If a third party, such as an employer or a student financial aid program, paid those costs, the student does not receive reimbursement. But the Private Post-Secondary Act envisioned relief for these students too by restoring any loss of educational opportunity that they suffered. And the Act directed the Bureau to develop regulations for this. So state law provides for oversight of private post-secondary schools and relief for students, but a number of private post-secondary schools are exempt from state oversight under the Act. Notably, regionally accredited schools are exempt. WASC-accredited schools, which include Heald College, are entirely exempt, and schools under other regional accreditors are exempt except that they must contribute to STRIF. All schools are subject to the orderly school closure requirements. This exemption is changing due to some recent legislation. Senate Bill 1247, authored by Senator Ted Lieu last year, signed into law last September, removes the exemption for for-profit colleges that participate in the Veterans Education GI Bill benefits, and that's effective next January 1st. Schools that are exempt from Bureau oversight under state law can voluntarily opt to come under Bureau oversight, and many regionally accredited for-profit schools have done this already in advance of the new state authorization requirements that come into place July 1st. And these schools include University of Phoenix, DeVry, and several others. In addition to providing direct oversight through the Bureau for Private Post-Secondary Education, the state also reviews private institutions through its financial aid programs. Cal Grants are portable. Students who qualify for awards can use them at any eligible institution. And to be eligible, an institution must meet a number of basic requirements and also 2 performance standards. They must maintain graduation rates above 20%, and that goes to 30% in a couple of years. And they must maintain federal student loan default rates below 15.5%. These performance standards were first implemented in 2011 and then strengthened in 2012. And more than 80% of for-profit schools, including all of the Corinthian schools, lost eligibility for Cal Grants by 2012. Some institutions have regained eligibility since then, including all 10 Heald campuses, as you can see on page 7. So that concludes the background on oversight of private colleges. Page 8 provides a timeline of key events leading up to the Heald closure, and I'll highlight some of these. It's pretty small print. In the early to mid-2000s, Corinthian colleges acquired Wyoming Technical Institute, or WyoTech, and consolidated several other acquisitions into Everest colleges. By 2004, the California Attorney General was already investigating Corinthians' job placement rates, program quality, and business practices. And in 2007, the Attorney General and Corinthian reached an agreement, a settlement, in which Corinthian paid $6.5 million in student refunds and $700,000 in penalties, closed 11 substandard programs, and was enjoined from continuing various unlawful practices. In 2010, Corinthian acquired Heald from a private equity group that had bought the nonprofit chain just 3 years before and converted it to for-profit schools. From 2010 to 2014, there were a series of federal and state investigations of Corinthian schools, including General Accountability Office secret shopper investigation, a 2-year investigation by the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, led by Senator Tom Harkin, another California Attorney General investigation, and also nationally investigations by more than 30 attorneys general of for-profit schools, U.S. Department of Education, and federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau investigations. And these investigations documented numerous cases of misrepresentation, especially regarding job placement rates, deceptive marketing, high-pressure enrollment tactics, predatory lending, among other infractions. So that takes us to last summer, when the Department of Education suspended Corinthians' access to federal student loan funds. The same month, California's Department of Veterans Affairs suspended Corinthians' eligibility for veterans benefits under the GI Bill. And then in July, Corinthian agreed with the U.S. Department of Education that it would sell or close all of its campuses over the next 6 months. And the Department of Education restored its eligibility for student aid funds, its access to those funds, in order to facilitate an orderly sale and wind down. Corinthian was able to sell most of its campuses in February of this year to ECMC, which is a student loan guarantee agency, and ECMC put them into a new nonprofit arm. It was not able to sell its California campuses and a handful of others. In February, the Student Aid Commission suspended Cal Grant payments for new Heald College students, not continuing students, but new ones at Heald colleges. And last month, the Department of Education fined Heald colleges for $30 million for misrepresenting job placement rates and ordered them to stop enrolling students. Also last month, the Bureau for Private Post-Secondary Education ordered Everest and Wyotech to stop enrolling students. 4 days later, Corinthian announced the immediate closure of all of its campuses, and last week filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. That takes us to page 9, some key facts about Corinthian colleges as of the most recent information available. As you can see, there were 23 campuses in California, enrolling about 10,000 students, although some estimates have that as high as 13,000 students. There were about 2,000 Cal Grant recipients receiving $3.4 million in state financial aid funds. The figure also shows you which schools are regulated by the Bureau and eligible for the Student Tuition Recovery Fund. Because Heald was WASC accredited, it was not under the Bureau, didn't choose to voluntarily come under the Bureau, so its students are not eligible for the STRIF. Students from all 3 schools are eligible, however, for the federal student loan discharge for closed schools. So what are the implications for students and the state? The closure affected more than 10,000 California students. There are a number of state, federal, and private agencies offering help to former Corinthian students with information, referrals, and assistance, and you'll be hearing from some of them this morning. Students are eligible for financial relief from the STRIF and federal student loan discharge. Many students have private student loans as well as federal student loans, and private loans don't have standard discharge provisions. Those terms are up to the lenders, so the situation's more complicated for those students. They may be able to get some relief from STRIF for student loan interest related to required charges that they paid. In addition, the Bureau has draft regulations right now that would allow STRIF payments on behalf of students whose tuition was paid by third parties, such as Cal Grants. The payments would go to the student's next school to restore the educational opportunity that was lost. At this point, however, these regulations would not help Heald students because Heald students are not eligible for the STRIF under the current law. In addition to students, the closures affected about 2,000 Corinthian employees, and it's possible that the Corinthian closure is just a beginning. There are several other large colleges under similar regulatory, financial, and legal pressure. Declining enrollment and revenues, tougher federal regulations, efforts to close that GI Bill loophole in the 9010 law threaten the viability of many of these schools that are so dependent on federal student aid. In March, the Department of Education released a list of more than 500 schools that are on a watch list due to financial and administrative concerns. 54 of those were in California. And the committee may be concerned to know that among the referrals that the Department of Education is making for former Corinthian college students, they've included schools that are on this watch list. In closing, I would note that the state has incomplete information right now about the extent of the problem and potential solutions. We have limited information about the Corinthian students and where they were in their educational programs, to what extent they'll be able to transfer credits to other institutions, how many had student loans, financial aid, or other third-party payers. We also haven't fully explored how other state agencies may be able to help these students. For example, for an occupation that requires a student to complete an educational program and pass a licensing exam, are there any provisions for students who nearly completed their programs and can pass the licensing exam? We also don't know the status of current efforts in Washington to expand eligibility for federal student loan discharge. So these are some of the questions to keep in mind as you hear the other panelists this morning. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hyman, questions? Ms. Leva?
Good morning. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive report. I have two questions. One, the 500 schools that are on the watch list, what places them on a watch list?
They're under a provision called heightened financial scrutiny, and it's due primarily to financial reasons, concerns about their audited financial statements and their financial health. Sometimes it's less serious. It's a matter of not having gotten their audited statements in on time, and sometimes it's much more serious, such as troubling debt-to-equity ratios, long delays in paying their creditors, and the like.
And could we get a list of the 54 that are in California?
Certainly.
That'd be
I'll
great.
send that to the staff.
And then a more general question is, and maybe a broader question is, how do we keep this from happening? You know, this is just, these predatory schools seem to be more and more of a problem. And, you know, in reading the report last night, you can get your loans forgiven if they're not private loans, and it can be more complicated, as you said, or maybe you can transfer to another school. But there's so many students now that they're not going to complete their degree, or they're going to have to start over. How do we prevent this from happening in the future?
Many of the current efforts to increase regulation and also to increase just to better implement existing regulations are aimed at preventing this from happening in the future and preventing more students from getting caught up in it. For example, the rules that the legislature passed a few years ago to strengthen the requirements for institutions participating in Cal Grants, as I mentioned, disqualified 80% of for-profits, many of which may have had similar problems. Likewise, the new federal regulations that require that students achieve gainful employment as measured by their debt-to-earnings ratios will weed out some schools. So some of it is enforcement, and some of it is increased regulation.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Block?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, ironically, Senator Leva, some of our own enforcement attempts over the last several years, and the federal government's as well, contributed to driving Corinthian out of business and resulted in this situation. But that's a good thing because they were graduating students who couldn't get jobs in their field anyway. I think as the years go on and the legislation we've already put into force takes place with the new generation of students, that we'll see an improvement. My question to you is regarding the WASC accreditation. The fact that HEALD was WASC accredited really complicates matters for students who aren't therefore eligible for STRIF funding. Did WASC accredit HEALD before they were acquired by Corinthian College, do you know?
I believe so. I can check on that for you, but HEALD has been WASC accredited for quite a while. It was a nonprofit initially, right. And most likely was WASC accredited, but I'll confirm that for you.
Because I'd be curious if an acquisition or a change from nonprofit to profit triggers a new accreditation, because my guess is the old HEALD College might have looked very different from HEALD College as a Corinthian college. And if there was no re-examination, then I would hope that the exception for WASC accredited colleges, or at least legislation could be proposed that the exemption for WASC accredited colleges doesn't apply if the accreditation predates them becoming a for-profit college, because the Bureau oversees for-profit colleges. That's something we need to look into, but that's, I think, important to, either WASC was maybe asleep at the wheel on this, or the college changed a great deal after WASC did their accreditation.
Senator, the exemption for WASC-accredited for-profits is in effect shrinking and becoming less useful to the colleges because of both state and federal actions. So the state action last year to require that for-profit schools in California that accept GI Bill benefits be under the Bureau is requiring all of the large for-profits to come under the Bureau by next January. In addition, the new federal state authorization rules have driven most of the large for-profits to come under the Bureau, and I understand that even HEALD had taken some steps to look toward coming under the Bureau for that purpose. And that requirement goes into place July 1st of this year. So there will be much less room for for-profit colleges to stay out from under state regulation in the future.
Thank you.
Senator Hill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You mentioned some of the programs that the U.S. Department of Education is forwarding Corinthian students into. I guess my concern is about the effort that could result in students being transferred into schools and institutions that are unstable and present the same problem or could present the same problem for these students in the future. Do you know if the Department of Education has looked at this and what their position is on that? Have they kind of transferred or kind of forwarded students in the right direction, or is there a potential problem that we may have to deal with in the future?
I believe it is a potential problem that you may have to deal with in the future. It's unfortunate the department isn't represented here today. They have been widely criticized for this, both in California and in Washington. I believe what they did was simply to lay out all of the nearby federal student aid approved schools in the area of each of the closed schools that offer similar programs, and they didn't use a filter such as the watch list. They are under some criticism now, but I don't know if they're planning to change their approach. They still have posted the referral schools that include the watch list schools.
Thank you.
Senator Hancock, you've got a furrowed brow.
I thought we were exchanging looks of consternation. Yeah, this is quite a story. Really, I had just one question, which is it possible for us to get a list of the enrolled students so that someone can reach out to them with some of their options, including watch out for the watch list? And also try to resolve some of the tuition recovery issues, because for many of these students, this is really a matter of long-term career expectations, and they are in debt, and they don't have the money to make this up. And it does seem to me, if there's only really about 2,500 of them, we ought to be able to find them and offer them some kind of help.
I think they're more than...
You'll be hearing later this morning from the Bureau for Private Post-Secondary Education and the Office of the Attorney General. I believe that they have the names of the students that were currently enrolled at the time of closure. I'm not clear whether they have the students who were enrolled within the last 120 days who also are eligible for some of these benefits. And it's and all of these lists need to be verified to make sure that they're accurate. In addition, the Student Aid Commission should have information about all of the Cal Grant eligible students that were at HEALD College during this time. So some of the information has been collected, but it's not complete.
Okay, and I would just echo what Senator Leyva alluded to, which is if you have concrete suggestions, because this was a very, really excellent laying out of the issues, would you let the committees know? Because sometimes it takes a crisis like this to make us do what we need to do to protect our students.
Yes.
Senator Galgiani.
First of all, I'd like to thank the chair for allowing me to be on here in the committee today. I have 2 of these schools in my district, and we actually had a workshop last week inviting students to come, and we had representatives from the Student Aid Commission and from EDD, because there are employees that have lost their jobs like that as well. And we tried to address some of the issues that came up, but one of the things that I'm hearing now that is very, very disturbing is the fact that these students are being given a list that includes those schools that are on the watch list. So these students who have been victimized once, in a sense, could possibly be victimized again, is what it sounds like.
That's correct.
So, and I was asked about that, you know, what about these students? How can they be sure that this isn't going to happen to them again? And I didn't know how to respond, but I also had no idea that they were being steered toward a list of schools where they have no idea that they could be walking into the same exact situation again.
Yes, and I think that's where Senator Hancock's suggestion of reaching out to these students really comes into play, to make sure that they understand the risks and that they understand their options. The community colleges, who you'll be hearing from, also have been participating in those meetings to make sure that students are aware of those possibilities. But it will be very important to make sure that students have all the information they need to make good decisions.
And how can we access that list of schools on the watch list?
I can provide that to your staff. And in fact, was that in the, I believe it's in your agenda packet.
Senator Bates?
I'm not sure my question goes to an appropriate role of the state, but what seems to be at the bottom of it is failed business models for establishing these schools. And when we look to the future and how we really need technical schools to be out there in terms of seeing our economy change in its nature, do we have anything that presents a best practices, a model, and is there a role for the accreditation process to include that as individuals decide to, develop, private, nonprofit, or for-profit schools like this, because they are an essential component in education of, the new worker. But, to have 500 on the watch list based on their audited financial statements, to me, it's, don't we need to look at a direction to be providing some sort of plan, best practices before we actually allow schools to be established? And again, I'm not sure it's the state's role, but there's got to be something in there to direct the, incorporation of these kinds of facilities.
Yes, and one of the reasons that these schools are so vulnerable related to the business model is that they're so entirely dependent on third-party payers, and specifically federal student aid funds. There have been efforts to include veterans' benefits in the 90%, which would push down the reliance on federal sources of aid. Those have been defeated so far federally, but there are continued efforts to do that. The state, for its financial aid program, certainly could put in place stricter guidelines. Accreditors, because of the division of labor among the triad, accreditors really have focused more on educational quality concerns through peer review and less on the business practices and the business model. Although in recent years, because of some of these problems, they have stepped up some of their oversight of financials as well.
I think that's where we need to put more emphasis.
Thank you, Senator Bates. I mean, I just want to comment because the Bureau is going to have a review with Senator Hill's committee in the fall, and I think this whole situation begs for more, quote, heaven forbid, government does more regulation, but certainly more scrutiny as to who gets on the list as to providers of educational services. And so that doesn't help solve the current problem, but certainly the Student Aid Commission and the Bureau and any other agency that would be interested in this conversation should be part and parcel of what we can do to help protect California students. Senator Hancock.
Yeah, just another quick question. Does the strip have enough money in it to make these students whole?
I'll let the Bureau representative address that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Senator
Madam
Hill?
Chair, thank you. Do we know what the amount, the exposure is from the healed students in terms of loan that may be eligible, well, not eligible, but maybe part of this, the repayment plan or something we've developed?
I have not seen a total for that. Be happy to look into that. So the amount of the federal student loans that
The federal student loans
they have outstanding?
right, the
Yeah.
exposure that those students have. So we have some idea of what the breadth of that problem is.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Thank you, Ms. Hyman.